Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. You find us online at virginiainstitute.org so that as people come up to you and start throwing narrative around at you, you'll have actual thoughtful responses to their protestations and sometimes machinations in general. First up this week from the National Right to Work Foundation, back on the program with us is Mark Mix. Happy New Year, Mark. How are you doing, sir?
I'm fine, Joe. Thanks for the opportunity to start the new year out with, a new administration, new policies, a new country, I suspect. I'm using my finger quotes here, but indeed, it is interesting that we are in the new year and there's lots of work to do, obviously.
Well, I thought it was amazing. One of the first things he did is he stuck it to one of the labor unions that backed him by pulling the plug on the Keystone XL pipeline and putting thousands of union workers out of work. I guess that'd be one of those great moments where the National Right to Work Foundation and the National Labor Relations Board should step in and say, maybe you guys were screwed over by your union bosses.
Well, indeed, it was, I think it was in May when Biden indicated that he was going to shut down the Keystone Pipeline, and the Pipe Fitters Union, one of the primary unions on the job, endorsed him in August. So if I'm a rank-and-file worker in the Pipe Fitters Union now, and I'm sitting in the unemployment office today because my project has been shut down by a president who, claims to be Lunch Bucket Joe and a union household man. He put at least 8,000, some believe it's up to 11,000 union workers out of work. And then with his executive order to stop and suspend the drilling and energy activities on federal land, both in the water and on land, he's putting literally millions of workers out of work, possibly. And union officials, this shows, Joe, why there is a huge disconnect between union officials and rank-and-file workers. On one hand, you have union officials who want to curry favor with Joe Biden and his 52-year career in Washington, D.C., or have curried favor with him. And on the other hand, you have folks out there that are trying to put food on the table for their families, and yet union officials, if for example, we lived in a non-right-to-work state, which some people are trying to do here in Virginia, workers would be forced to pay for that, quote, representation, Joe.
It's amazing. And several court cases about it, including one. Now there's a case with the National Labor Relations Board, and if I understand correctly, it is exactly that. It's labor union employees who have decided that their union representatives aren't working for them anymore. Tell us about it, Mark.
Yeah, Joe, this is one of those stories that just point out the injustice of compulsory unionism. This is a case where we're representing two employees from Transdev, Transportation, which runs the Fairfax Connector bus system up here in Fairfax County. Mm-hmm. And those folks there are represented by the Office of Professional Employees International Union Local 2. And it's been a very interesting story. These employees came to us because there was no contract in place, and the union was negotiating, quote, on behalf of these workers, unquote. And on June of last year, the workers voted no on a tentative contract that the union officials had put forward after negotiations with their employer. And they were so disappointed with the negotiations and the fact that the agreement was so bad that they decided to start a decertification process. Well, in the meantime, in October, union officials informed some employees there, based on the facts of the case, that they were going to try to negotiate a new agreement, and they intended to sign it without a vote of the workers. So the union officials were going to cut the deal with the employer, and the workers who had just rejected a contract 3 months earlier, they were going to impose the contract without a vote. So the employees, immediately trying to use their power under the National Labor Relations Act, got petitions and got the necessary number of workers to sign a petition asking for the NLRB to hold a decertification election, Joe, that is the vote that would say we no longer want to be associated with the union. We're going to decertify them as our representative. Mm-hmm. Well, they filed the decertification on November 10th of last year, and they were informed after they filed this petition from the NLRB that a new contract had indeed been signed. And since the new contract had been signed, the regional director of the National Labor Relations Board rejected the decertification petition of the majority of workers who signed the document to try to get the union out, and said you could no longer have this election because you are now under a non-statutory regulation called the contract bar, which is a creation of the National Labor Relations Board, that basically says you can't have an election to decertify a union for up to 3 years. So now these workers who voted no on a contract, who had a contract imposed on them without getting a chance to vote, who tried to decertify the union, are now blocked and must be in the union for the next 3 years.
How is that even defensible, Mark? I mean, how could you say you can't do something for 3 years? I mean, what kind of country have we become under these unknown, faceless bureaucrats that just kind of write this policy?
Yeah, Joe, this is really, we've got a couple of cases. We got one in Delaware right now. We're representing a class of 800 workers at a poultry farm up there who tried the same thing, to decertify the union. They're having a little more luck because the contract that was negotiated with the employer was an illegal contract and had an illegal clause. So this regulatory creation called the contract bar didn't apply in that election, in that situation. And the NLRB is asked for rulemaking and advice on what to do about this very contract bar that was created by the board. It's not in statute, so it's not a law. It's a regulation imposed by the NLRB over the years, going back to the late 1950s. What do we do about it? We expose it, and we bring transparency to it. And this type of outrage, I mean, in Virginia, if these workers weren't protected by the right to work law, there would be a union security clause in that contract, and they would have to pay dues for this representation, let alone allow the union to speak for them on their behalf under the law. It's really an amazing situation, Joe, and one that I think the more people that understand how this works, the more outrage you have. And I think here in Virginia, we're going to need to make sure that the House of Delegates and the State Senate understand how important the right to work law is here, and this case demonstrates that in spades.
How close, how tenuous is right to work in the Commonwealth this year? I mean, we see how, the new administration, as you said, in air quotes, in Washington has been working at a breakneck pace, to rewrite all the federal code that has been done through executive orders over the last 4 years. And, unfortunately, when nothing gets legislated, that is how it winds up happening. How tenuous right now is the General Assembly's grip on the right to work in the Commonwealth?
Yeah, Joe, if it weren't for the outpouring of opposition to what was proposed in the last Legislative General Assembly last year, where they did introduce a right to work repeal bill in the House and in the Senate, and there is a bill pending in the House of Delegates right now, introduced by Lee Carter of Manassas Park, who is an announced socialist who is one of his primary objectives is to do away with Virginia's right to work law, to force everyone to pay a private organization for the privilege of working in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It doesn't look like the bill's got much traction. There is not a bill in the Senate. That's good news. Last year, it was Dick Saslaw that introduced that bill, which gave us, heart palpitations because it was the day before the session started, and here's the Senate Majority Leader introducing a bill to repeal Virginia's right to work law. It went to a committee, Joe, and Lynn, and you know how stacked these committees are. This committee we went to was 12 Democrats and 3 Republicans, even though the partisan divide is what, 1 seat or 2 seats now with a vacancy.
That's amazing to me. Just as a subtext, how they can get away with that. And then they say, because they'll have like 1 or 2 cursory committees that are closely held. But these committees are ridiculous, Mark. There's an irrepresentative of the voice of the people, and then all that comes to the floor are things from the extreme wings of whichever party decides it.
Yeah, Joe, it's called exercising power, and the left and the regressive movement, as I like to call them, they're not progressing anywhere. They're regressing back to a feudal system, if you will, the Dark Ages, and I think it's our new president that calls it the Dark Winter ahead. So I'm kind of paraphrasing off of his framing of where we are today, but they exercise power. They understand it, they exercise it. When they have it, they use it, and this is a clear example. A 12-3 ratio on a committee when the chamber is divided by 1 seat is just, somebody understands the exercise of power, and it's only when we expose it. And Joe, you've done a great job of that, and we just need to keep talking to Virginians about what's happening because, we're going to have a gubernatorial election coming up. We've got the House of Delegates coming up in November of this year, and it's just crucial we keep track of what they're up to so that we know what we're supporting and what we're opposing.
Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Foundation, is on with us. It's nrtw.org. And we're talking in abstract and in specificness about first this Fairfax Connector contract. And it strikes me that this is exactly what FDR was afraid of. Even the great lion of progressivism said, the one place he didn't want to see labor unions was in the government. And the abstract is, of course, the government is never going to, the danger of the government going out of business is never in the back of the mind of the union who's negotiating. But we also see these backroom deals where the politicians want votes, so they make deals with the union bosses to either get campaign volunteers and or just straight up votes in exchange for favorable contracts. And then, once you get enough government unions, you probably wind up having to pick and choose which one is the most likely to continue to get the government aid.
Yeah, indeed, and that's one of the things that Roosevelt mentioned was this idea of private sector union model, this confrontational model that's been created is just can't be applied to government. But yet here we are, and today, last week, the Department of Labor came out with the annual union membership data, and guess what, Joe? No surprise to you, there are more public sector union members in America than there are private sector union members. So that last time that happened was 2009. It's happening again, and you're absolutely right about this. And in Virginia, unfortunately, the Democrats in Richmond didn't take then-Governor Doug Wilder's advice on a bill that he signed in 1993, saying that, Virginia taxpayers and the Commonwealth of Virginia is well served by the process that we have where we, as the legislature and the executive branch, get to listen to all kinds of people, but ultimately we make decisions about how government is run. And he put out a bill that prohibited the recognition of unions as bargaining agents on behalf of government employees across the Commonwealth. Well, that law is no longer in place. Dick Sass law put in a bill that gave local authorities and municipalities and counties the ability to start unionizing and recognizing and bargaining with unions over Virginians' taxpayer money. That could happen starting in May of this year.
Well, and I think this is the first place you're going to see it, I think, especially in this era of COVID, is amongst teachers' unions. I think the NEA is probably just salivating over the idea of all these frightened teachers who don't want to go back in the classroom organizing.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, on Monday, you saw that the Chicago Teachers Union decided to keep all the teachers out in what now is an illegal strike. But there'll be no punishment for that. The union officials will simply ask for amnesty and till their terms are met. And their terms really, as we saw from the Los Angeles teachers unions and other teacher unions around the country, their demands aren't really about health and safety in the classroom. It's about a radical agenda that goes beyond education, that goes beyond schools, that goes to the very heart of the regressive movement. So, yeah, they've got great power, and Virginians ought to be ready because that power is coming to our Commonwealth.
And it needs to be, not that we take campaign positions, but this needs to be brought up in this General Assembly campaign and the gubernatorial campaign, because it can be undone if the General Assembly changes its power structure and the governor's mansion changes to a conservative-minded soul, that you could get a bill passed that would kind of put the genie back into Virginia's bottle a little bit. Couldn't we, Mark?
That's right, Joe. You could certainly do that. And as we know, what the legislature passed back in 1993 and then was signed by Governor Doug Wilder was done away with by a bill by Dick Sass law that was signed by Governor Northam. The interesting part about it is they realized that because of the financial crisis that COVID was presenting, they delayed the implementation of it. And when we talk about the cost of government, that's an admission that what we were saying was correct, that the cost of government is going to rise dramatically. Otherwise, if it wasn't going to cause any harm, why didn't they implement it right away? Well, because they know what this is all about, Joe, and you explained it very well. They know that, the campaign volunteers, so-called, I'm using my finger quotes again, volunteers, and the money that flows from organized labor into the political process here in Virginia and across the country is something that many politicians look for, pine for, and are successful because of. But Virginians need to pay attention, and that's what's so important about the work that you do, Joe, and that the Institute does, because getting the word out is absolutely essential between now and the end of the year.
Oh, we have to, because sadly, those who would support these kind of horrible economy-killing policies paint it, and they're so artful in the way they paint it, Mark, as if they're out there helping the little guy, when really they are the least interested in the little guy. The public service unions are there to take care of those who are working in the union, not support better public service. And so we wind up, and then in the private sector, you wind up with things costing more and more and more, and the poorest of us wind up getting left further and further behind.
Indeed. The stories, the story in Transdev, our little case here on behalf of a couple employees in Northern Virginia, is just a great indicator of that. And Joe, there's no lack of these. At any given time, the foundation is litigating between 230 and 260 cases on behalf of individual employees who are exercising what rights they think and what rights they know they should have in America's workplaces. And the power of organized labor granted by government is really unique to any other institution. The idea that you can force someone to pay a fee to work to a private organization is just a power that people should shake their head at. And we know that 8 out of 10 Americans believe it's wrong, but being right is not enough. Being right is not enough. You don't win battles just because you're right. You win them because you organize and mobilize and you pay attention to what government's doing.
Yeah, at very least, we have to look at how organized and mobilized those who would take away employees' rights have been, right, Mark?
Yeah, indeed, and no doubt union officials were very, very busy. Think about those pipe fitters. They actually endorsed a president who cost the union at least 8,000 jobs, and everyone says, yeah, no harm, no foul here, and no one seems to make a big deal of it, except for, hopefully, those pipe fitters out there that are sitting at the unemployment office today trying to find a way to put food on the table. Their union bosses don't seem to care. The president doesn't seem to care. The administration doesn't seem to care. But Americans who are faced with the reality of the implications of the exercise of forced unionism, they should be caring a lot more.
Mark Mix, I think we got distracted off of it by discussing the egregious misrepresentation of some of these committees in the Virginia General Assembly, but you were taking us a little bit into this contract bar that specifically is hitting these Transdev employees in Fairfax because, now, if I understand it correctly, so once the union agrees to a contract, the employees have no recourse for 3 years. Is that it, or?
That's correct, Joe. That's the regulation as is enforced today. It's called the contract bar. There's a whole series of bars that have been created through legislative work and NLRB administrative decisions, and this is one of them. This is not in the statute. I mean, workers under the Taft-Hartley Act that was overridden, that was passed by overriding President Truman's veto in 1947. It says workers have the right to associate, to mutual aid, to benefit, to bargain, all this good stuff. And it also says they have the right to refrain. But it also goes on to say, unless there is an agreement that forces them to pay dues or join a union as a condition of employment, that's another story altogether. But here it is. You have workers trying to refrain, but yet the board that was promulgated to enforce labor policy creates a burden, a bar, that stops them from participating, in this case, for up to 3 years. It's outrageous.
And these are, in many cases, you mentioned some legislated, but some just put together by government bureaucracies that are just funded by our Congress or our General Assembly and given the permission to go manage their business model as best they see fit.
Yeah, it really is amazing. And when you think about the origins of organized labor in America, I mean, Samuel Gompers, the founder, the father of the American labor movement, said that the workers of America adhere to voluntarism. Anything else will destroy that which is brought together through voluntarism. It is invincible. He knew that once the unions started to go to government for privileges, they would become wards of the government. And that's what they are. Their privilege and their power and their compulsion is a function of government activity. Government has granted them power outside the boundaries of anybody else. You and I can't get it, John. We can redress the legislature in Richmond. We can go down there and talk, and we can give them great arguments, and we can mobilize people, and we can bring our signs, and we can come down, talk to them, but they don't have to listen to us. In the labor movement, in the union movement, government entities in the states that have bargaining, and Virginia has that now, they have the ability to do that, you must negotiate with unions over taxpayer money. So you're putting union officials in a privileged position between elected officials and taxpayers. And that doesn't work. It hasn't worked in California. It hasn't worked in Illinois. It hasn't worked in New York. It hasn't worked in Connecticut. It doesn't work in New Jersey. Those states that are fiscal basket cases that are probably going to be bailed out by this president for decades of mismanagement that includes giving that power to union officials that you mentioned earlier, that negotiation, finger quote, negotiation process again. It does matter, and it does cost people money, and it costs people their livelihood. And compulsion doesn't work. It can't work. It works temporarily, but it can't work all the time, and we should know that, and we must pay attention here in Virginia.
Well, and you talk about compulsion, and using that word, I think, will strike at a lot of people's hearts because that seems like such an un-American concept. But even beyond that, as a klaxon, when you watch the federal government, you mentioned the possibility of all these states getting bailouts for their, just behavior towards municipal employees, and often the only jobs they'll create are municipal government jobs. That at some point, if we don't stay the reserve currency for the world, and the loyal listeners of this program are rolling their eyes like, here he goes again with the doom and gloom. But if we don't stay the reserve currency, we're going to collapse like every other democracy did when they realized that, gee, if we put the right guy in the Roman Senate, my business is going to do better, or I'm going to make more money.
Yeah, that's the deep end of the pool there, John. But you're right. I mean, at some point when people say, you know what, we have no faith in the dollar because the dollar doesn't mean anything, lots of things change quickly and change dramatically. That's kind of the notion about the minimum wage. You have a government pushing, and Biden has signed an executive order now that, there's going to be a $15 an hour minimum wage for all government sector workers under federal control. He's pushing for that. And, you must be a signatory to a union contract to provide services to the government. That in itself, in a minor scale compared to what you're talking about, is inflationary. You're saying that we're going to set the cost of business no matter what, no matter what the implications of it are, and raising the cost. And those costs are passed along. Anyone that can't understand that just as maybe they've been in the government school system too long. I'm not sure, John.
Well, one thing, Mark, is that when you look at the minimum wage increase, it's a union bailout, because then that pushes up all of the unions' bars for their contracts. Generally speaking, by whatever percentage the minimum wage went up.
That's exactly right. If you were making $6 more than an entry-level person at your place of employment, and that entry-level person is now at $15 an hour, what do you have to have?
21.
Exactly. And where does that cost go?
Yep.
Anyway,
well,
I'm sorry, you got me all riled up. I've had too much caffeine this morning, John. I apologize. Or Joe, excuse me. I apologize about that.
It's okay, Mark. You for what you do at the National Right to Work Foundation, you can call me Phil for all I care.
I'm sorry, Joe.
It's not at all. Mark Mix, please join them on their journey. NRTW.org. Help them do what they do. You heard he's hundreds and hundreds of cases across the country every year. And it could just get worse, but I do deeply appreciate what you're doing here, and keep us up to date on this case out of Fairfax and all the other ones you're doing, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks for what you do. I appreciate it so much.
Well, not at all. Coming up next, Sarah Anderson from Freedom Works on our favorite HR1 on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.